Good evening, everyone. There are more seats up front if folks are still looking for seats. There's a few seats up here in the front, over here. All right. How's everyone doing? Awesome. You're welcome. Thanks, Chef Liam, when you see him. Welcome to the Fine Arts Work Center. Thank you for joining us for our December FAWC Friday event. We appreciate you for being here tonight. My name is Terry Kehoe. I'm the Fellowship Director at the Fine Arts Work Center, the small but mighty space at the edge of Cape Cod that since 1968 has welcomed and nurtured thousands of artists and writers from across the US and around the world. We do this most notably through our flagship 7-month fellowship program and our popular summer workshops, as well as through programs such as FAWC Online and this event, FAWC Friday. Hosted on the first Friday of the month between November and February during the fellowship season, FAWC Friday is the Work Center's invitation to our community, to you, and beyond, to gather here on campus, share a meal, make and view art, and celebrate the work of our featured contemporary creators. Tonight, we are in for a real treat. We are so lucky to have visual artist Shada Soleimani and writer Nicholas Boggs here, both of whom will be sharing their work with us momentarily on stage. And later on this evening, we're so excited to be screening Lise Bok-King's film, Painting Time, a 19-minute documentary about artist and former FAWC fellow Esteban Del Valle and his completed mural in Provincetown. Esteban is also the architect, chief person behind that painting that you see here in the room. Thank you, Shada, Nicholas, and Lise, for sharing your work with our community tonight. Speaking of thank yous, a big thanks to Chef Liam and Salty Market for providing tonight's food. I can tell you've all enjoyed it. And a big shout out to DJ Emerson for getting the vibes right. Thank you. So just a quick one to show to let you know what's in store for the rest of the evening. Following presentations by Shada and Nicholas, we'll participate in a Q&A with the audience. We have copies of Nicholas's recent New York Times bestseller, Baldwin, A Love Story, available for sale, and he'll be signing books in Gallery B behind this wall right after we're done here on stage. Once this portion of the evening is over, we invite you to visit our gallery. We're in the front space, directly kind of behind that wall over there, that side of the wall. We'll be screening Lise Bok-King's Painting Time. It'll be screening on loop. And in the back space of the gallery, we have set up a holiday market where you can purchase new FAWC merchandise and books for yourselves and your loved ones. We also invite you across the courtyard and into the print shop for some fun, hands-on art-making activities with artist and print shop manager Vicky Tomeko. Lastly, a selection of current fellows have opened their studios this evening to show you what they've been working on. Studios 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 13 each have a colorful banner above them, which means they are open for you to explore, so please go check them out. I want to take a moment to thank Mass Cultural Council, Provincetown Tourism Fund, and the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod, who are among the many generous institutional partners that help make FAWC Friday community events possible. And a huge thank you as well to the many individuals who help FAWC make our work possible. If you enjoy FAWC's free events, and I hope you will consider making a contribution this evening so we can continue to care for forthcoming generations of artists and writers. Yeah, just finally a few housekeeping items before we get started. There are 2 restrooms and a water fountain down that hallway to my right and to your left. We have assisted listening devices and cushions for chairs at the back of the room. Please grab a cushion if you would like and ask a staff member to help you with an assisted listening device if you need one. And last but not least, please turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. Now it is my pleasure to welcome current visual arts fellow Dominique Munoz, who will introduce our first presenter of the evening.
Thank you, Terry. Hello, everyone. Hope you all are staying nice and warm. Um, I'm honored to introduce tonight's visiting artist, Sheda Soleimani, whose work blends sculpture, collage, and film into striking, magical, realist compositions rooted within the language of photography. In Soleimani's work, the photo studio becomes a theatrical space where histories are restaged, challenged, and reimagined. In these constructed tableaus, she confronts the complex power dynamics between the Southwest Asia and North Africa regions with the West. In her most recent projects, she shifts her focus inward, highlighting the stories of her own parents, political refugees from Iran. Her photo sets often draw us in with vibrant colors, deep shadows, and playful use of materials. Every element is purposeful, a backdrop serving as a stand-in for place, a prop functioning as a metaphor, the lighting as an emotional cue. In Soleimani's images, these choices are infused with tenderness. She gives her collaborators a presence that is legible without being fully exposed. A choreography of protection unfolds. What is revealed, what is withheld, and what it means to make someone visible without exposing their vulnerability to the camera's gaze. In this way, Soleimani encourages us to confront what we might otherwise overlook: state violence, corruption, the ethics of testimony. She disarms us and then challenges us to reconsider what we believe we understand. Outside the studio, Soleimani is also a wildlife rehabilitator and founder of Congress of the Birds, a federally licensed wild bird rehabilitation center in Rhode Island. Her mother, formerly a nurse in Iran, turned to caring for injured birds after arriving in the US, and the connection between these acts of tending and care shaped Soleimani's ethos as an artist and activist. Soleimani's work is part of the permanent collections, including the Guggenheim Museum, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, MIT List Visual Arts Center, and Caddis, Paris. Her work has gained international recognition through exhibitions at institutions including the International Center for Photography in New York, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and has been featured in publications such as Frieze, the New York Times, Art in America, Interview Magazine, and many others. She holds an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art and a BFA from the University of Cincinnati College of Art, and is currently an associate professor of studio art at Brandeis University. Please join me in welcoming Sheda Soleimani.
What an intro. Thank you so much. I hope I could live up to it. I'm just going to put this up here. Okay, a few things. I speak really fast. I think it's because Farsi is my first language, and Farsi is a lot faster than English. So if I'm going too fast, just yell at me. I'm really informal. I cuss a lot. I'm so sorry. My baba taught me that, words don't really matter, and I'm really crass. So I'm just going to kind of go for it. And if you have questions, you can literally just yell. Everyone can hear me, I take it? Okay, so I have half an hour. I've never done an artist talk so quickly. So I'm going to just kind of hop into talking about my most recent work. The work that I was making before Ghostwriter, which is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, was really concerned with state-sanctioned violence, survivor testimony, specifically of individuals living in Iran under a totalitarian dictatorship, queer individuals who were harmed, women that do not have their own rights, all informed by my parents' stories, but never actually discussing what happened to my parents. And that's because I don't think that there is any sort of ethic to how journalists or artists often make work about violence. I remember the first time I had my first exhibition in London, and I was talking about women that had been executed under Iranian regime. It became sensationalized, and it became clickbait. And that really turned me away from wanting to actually make work about these types of topics. So I kind of moved into thinking about more global issues, not personal ones. Then the pandemic happened, and I'm a disaster thinker, and my parents are essential workers, so I was convinced they were going to die. And I called them, and I asked them if I could finally tell their stories, and they said yes. So I'm going to start with this image. So my parents are political refugees from Iran. My father is a Marxist leftist that was part of a political group that was very active against both the Shah as well as the Ayatollah. He was leading a lot of, protests, creating these documents that were being distributed, working, inside of the hospital to mobilize the actual physicians and the workers, and there was a bounty on his head. My mother was a nurse in the hospital and worked with my father staging these kind of readings inside of the emergency room, where they would turn the emergency room OR light on so no one could come in. They would have their political meetings and then stage their protests afterwards. But that was a short-lived moment, because when the Ayatollah's government came into power, that was, obviously not something that could continue. So both of them had to go into hiding, which I'll get into, but they both escaped. My mother was in solitary confinement for over a year, separated from my sister, and they came to the States at different times in the 80s. And like most good Middle Eastern parents, they don't believe in therapy. So I was their therapist. So this first image is a drawing that my mother made for me of the house that she grew up in. And this is the same house that my father went into hiding in the very first time, hiding under bags of rice when the Sepah came to look for him. And you kind of notice that it's like a really childlike drawing. My mother, she suffers from really bad PTSD because of what happened to her, and much of her, life is trying to explain to me all of these places that she's been and lived and all these experiences she's had. So this drawing not only talks about the house, but you'll maybe see some numbers kind of around it, and those are places where she buried 7 stillborn babies in jars under trees that her father planted. And so begins this kind of magical, realist, like tapestry of ghostwriter that I'm weaving. This is one of the trees, a naranj, which is a sour orange tree. So my father and mother worked in a guerrilla field hospital, a Kurdish field hospital. So if you know, Iranian government doesn't support the Kurds. There's a lot of state-sanctioned violence, and my parents are obviously pro-Kurd, and were working in these field hospitals where individuals were being harmed by chemical warfare. A lot of the women were coming in, giving birth to babies that were stillborn. And not knowing how to process that as a young woman, my mother started keeping them in jars and burying them in her garden. So she made me that drawing to tell me where to find them if I was to ever go to Iran. And I've been working a lot with their archive. I'm thinking, especially right now, given our really lovely political moment, what does it mean to be allowed to live somewhere? Or what are the papers or the documents that mean that we get to exist? And so this is the stamp on my mother's passport, admitted as a refugee pursuant to Section 207. All of the other things it says. I'm looking at the daily newspaper, Ruznameh Kehan, which my father's, when my father got to the border, he had to show proof that there was a bounty on his head. And so there's newspaper clippings of his speeches, but also a newspaper clipping offering the bounty on his head when he got to the border. So I'm working on a book right now with printed matter, and a lot of this archive is, coming in. So I'm just gonna kind of flip through these pretty quickly. The letters that they sent back and forth, I think stamps are a really incredible marker of political history and time. So you could see post-revolution, the way that these kind of propagandistic, the dove bleeding and the roses and the tulips, they all have these. I'm really interested in propaganda posters, so the stamps kind of take on that role. I mean, what a thing to call someone, a resident alien. That's my mom. And then back to my mom's drawings. So this is how she taught me about, where she grew up in her world. I grew up in Ohio, in the Bible Belt, which was not a very hospitable place to grow up as a queer Persian, especially post 9/11. And my father is really into humor and fucking with people. So that didn't really go very well for me either. I think after the 2004 election, he made a Halloween kind of thing where George Bush was being lowered into a coffin. And I really didn't have any friends at school after that. But I thank him for it now. But we also would go out to eat at what the fancy restaurant was, Olive Garden. And they had a paper tablecloth, and they would bring me crayons to do drawings. And my mom would take all those crayons, and she would start drawing on the tablecloths. And I don't know what compelled me to rip off all of those papers and keep them, but I've been keeping these tablecloths since I was 12, 13 years old. And so these are some of the drawings. They've become part of the archive and they've become part of the work. So this is Nuno Namak. So there's a way to it's an old wives' tale, to ward off snakes. You leave them an offering of bread and salt. And so this is the first photo that I made in 2021, right after we'd all been vaccinated and my parents could come. I was thinking a lot about, these are the images of the house that she grew up in the back. I'm thinking about this checkerboard theme that you're going to see a lot in these works, thinking about games, game theory and strategy, the games that immigrants and refugees have to play to be able to escape, so snakes and ladders specifically here. And I'm thinking a lot about masking, especially portraiture. I think there's so much about photographing the other and the history of that. In the history of photography, I joke, but it's not really a joke, that the history of photography is dominated by straight white men that stick their lens sticks into things non-consensually. It's true. And so what does it mean to take a photo? That's already an act of capture. It's a colonial kind of practice in itself. And it's the relatively the newest medium. We're not talking about AI. So, here I'm thinking about putting this mask in front of my parents to kind of protect them, thinking about how we're so accustomed, phrenology, physiognomy, reading people's identities and features by being able to look at their faces, what's their sociopolitical status, all of those things. So the mask is partially that, but also because their identities still need to be protected. My father is still very politically active. So these are the first two photos I made. And obviously the birds are in there too. We'll get into that. This is another drawing from a tablecloth. This is a drawing that my mom made repeatedly all the time. It's a drawing of her solitary confinement cell. And she would always describe to me, I think the most, profound thing that she would describe to me was the window and the direction in which the light would come in. So that she would stand and put her hands in the light of the window so they would warm up. And so here's one of the many sketches. And in Ghostwriter, this isn't me photographing them, it's me collaborating with them. There were 3 sets of rules when I called them to ask them if I could photograph them. First rule, they said, was that you tell us what the idea is and we talk it out. And my Baba talks ad nauseum. So there's a lot of well, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? That's not the right symbol. You got the date wrong. So there's, it's a lot of going back and forth. And the second is that, it's collaborative when they're in the studio. So they need to feel comfortable being in it. They get to pose themselves, or usually it's my mom poses my dad, and then my dad poses my mom, and then I just take the photo. And then the third is, if they don't like the image when it's done, then it's not shown. And that is a really important rule for me, especially when you're photographing someone else that's not you. So this is my mother in her solitary confinement cell recreation, images of the border. So she escaped. She was held in Khoy, which is a border town between Iran and Turkey. And then at the very top of that ladder, this is when I started using birds in my work for the first time. I've been rehabilitating birds as long as I could remember, because my mother, who was a nurse back in Iran, could no longer practice nursing when she came to the United States. And we grew up in Ohio, like I said, and people's favorite pastime is hitting animals with cars. And so she wasn't really accustomed to that, and she would bring home these animals that were half dead, half alive, and our kitchen island and our weird, suburban home became this OR. My Baba would bring home medical supplies from work, and my mother would use whatever skills she had to try to patch together these creatures to help them live again. And a lot of the times they died. And that's, this idea of death was introduced to me by a very traumatized person at a very young age. And so this work of caretaking is really important in my practice, and this kind of lineage of care, in Ghostwriter especially, is really important here. So this is a little fish crow that lived with me for over a year before I was able to release it back into the wild. It got stuck under a wood pallet, and it had a lot of carpal wounds. So we treated it, and it regrew its feathers, and now it's free. They're not all that happy, though, unfortunately. Another thing that, my mom talked about a lot, there's a lot of stories that she told me from when she was in solitary, but she told me once when we were working on this series, there's a lot that they are remembering when we've been working on this together, and that's been really extraordinary. So she remembered that she wrote a poem when she was in solitary. It's the only poem she's ever written her whole life. And it's a poem about being, it's maybe a little trite, but about being a trapped bird, a caged bird that the world has forgotten about. And so she wrote down this poem for me. And in this photo, she's holding an eastern bluebird that I rehabilitated, that we released right after this photo was taken. It lived with me for about 2 weeks in care as it recovered from a window strike injury. The bars of, the prison that she was kept in. And then the poem is actually physically screen printed on the photograph. And that drawing that you saw of her house then became the very first iteration of the gallery show. And I didn't even think that I was going to be showing this work. It was the pandemic. I had a friend that was like, you want to just test it out and put it in this college gallery, which if you're an artist, every college gallery show might not be that exciting. It's the best place to test out new things because no one sees it. So you're like, okay, cool. No one's going to see this. It's going to be fine. Let me try out this crazy idea. If it works, it's great. If it does, it doesn't. Anyways, I think it worked because I keep doing it. I don't know if that means anything, but I liked it. I'm into world building. I'm constantly building worlds, whether they be in my photographs or in real life. And I was really interested in this idea of these photographs moving through this world and being part of this world, not just objects on a wall. This is my father's suitcase that he actually escaped over the mountains with. It's called Sapphire. You actually see all of the tags. And my mother's as well. And paying homage to them as freedom fighters. So if you look in the background, that's actually the hospital that they worked in. It's from a postcard that my mother sent back home after she had gotten admitted to school there as a nurse. Lots of documents, obviously, coming into the archive. You've seen a little bit of them, but it's a lot of photos and a lot of my father's revolutionary writing and revolutionary kind of logos and art. More stories from my mom. This one's called The Blind Owl, after Sadiq Hidayat's existentialist text, Bouffacour. And so the birds are coming in again, there's always this, are they dead? Are they alive? What's their role? I'm really, really interested in how people project so much on animals. There's this thing in the art world right now that fucking drives me insane. That's all about animal-human collaboration. And I'm sorry, animals and humans, they don't collaborate because there's no consent. You can't be like, oh, hey, can I put you in the photo? It's totally fine, right? Or oh, yeah, I'm spiritually connected to you. I don't know if the owl thinks that. This owl is dead, technically, so, I didn't really get to ask for consent. But I'm really interested in how people try to project onto the non-human, and I think that's a huge part of this work, because what does it mean? A lot of people are like, oh, Shada, these birds know that you're helping them. And they probably think that they're in an episode of the X-Files, and I'm shining a light in their eyes, and they're like, where am I? And maybe miraculously, hopefully through weeks of care, they'll get better and they could be re-released. But I think there's such a fantasy and projection as to what we, think is happening versus what is. This image is called What a Revolutionary Must Know. It's a revolutionary handbook that my father wrote, teaching young revolutionaries and recently kind of what he calls awakened individuals how to participate in protest. And the red tulip is a symbol of the left that was then co-opted by the right post-revolution. The left is now trying to reclaim the symbol of the tulip. And of course, caretaking comes in too. So my mother feeding some of the American robins in my care. And, there's a lot of mythology that she's created. She always talks about this fruit called a batabi that no other Persian I've ever met has ever heard of. But she draws it for me all the time. And she says it's a mix between a pomelo and an autroge and an orange. And, so these are these kind of recreations. My father's drawing of him escaping over the mountains. When he was in a safe house in the mountains, he played chess, shatranj, with one of the men that kept the safe house, who was a recently escaped political prisoner. And then, like, if you're an artist, the artist block thing is, like, so real. I'm, like, in this moment where I just had my show at the ICP, and I made this piece, which, like, in my head is, like, my magnum opus. And I'm like, okay, I'm done. Like, I'm never going to make anything good again after this. So that's where I'm at right now, is, like, the next part of this is me telling you how I'm, like, losing my mind, like, experimenting and not sure where it's going. But my father always told me this story about how he escaped over the mountains. It was a 2.5-week journey over the Zagros Mountains on horseback with 2 smugglers. He never knew their names. What bothered me the most is that he didn't know the horse's name. I'm like, come on, that thing carried you, like, to safety, and you don't even know what it was called? He doesn't even remember what color it was. But I think these are the things when you're so frantic, escaping for your life. You don't remember, the details that someone in, like, telling a story like I am might wonder or might want. And so I decided that I would recreate his horse. He still didn't name it. But it is a life-size horse with hand screen printed fabric, all printed at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. It's a repeat pattern of Snakes and Ladders board with segments of the rug that he escaped with. So you kind of see that, and, like, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but those corners there are part of that same rug that he's sitting on. And so this is kind of his, escape but triumphant photo. And then, thinking about, like, symbols and metaphors, there's a lot of snakes in the work. I've had so many people be like, okay, so, like, the snakes are definitely evil, right? And that's exactly the type of thing that I want to challenge. It's like, why are we projecting such, like, symbols or metaphors of these creatures that we don't know or we don't contend with just because we've seen them in myth being portrayed as evil in some way, shape, or form? So they become kind of collaborators. And then in my, like, second part of my life, this is what I do. So my phone is ringing constantly. My phone number is public. Anytime that there is a bird or any animal, really, I take all species. I've been going on sea turtle walks while I've been here. I found some last night, actually. I get texts from all over the state of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire, beyond. And people just have found a bird that they don't know what to do with. And so they bring them to me. These are my patients. These are some young blue jays. But very much like how I'm thinking a lot about the kind of concurrencies between human migration and bird migration. Thinking about 70% of my patients die, and I would say at least 60% of those 70 I have to euthanize. And those patients are all maimed by human infrastructure. So this is osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection caused by fishing hooks. So obviously we're in the Cape too, so there's a lot of fishing hook and line injuries. I guess I should give a trigger warning. There's blood in the next image. This is a barred owl that's been hit by a car. So I'm dealing with a lot of, like, rodenticide issues as well. That's a cormorant that has a lesion inside of its mouth from a fishing line injury. This one's really gross. The next one's a maggot that's coming out of a baby hawk's ear. It's called fly strike. And so, very much like my mother, like, she worked in a leper asylum when she was in Iran. She worked in, like, the Kurdish field hospital. What does it mean to hold and process trauma and to see either humans or creatures, which, I think we're all kind of creatures, that are maimed by human infrastructure? And so I'm trying to draw these kinds of parallels between her patients and mine in this kind of animal-human collaboration thing. So this is kind of the first image that I made. I was doing physical therapy on this crow, and crows don't really like getting physical therapy, surprise, surprise. And so there was a lot of biting until people were like, oh my gosh, look, it loves you, it's touching you. And I'm like, no. There's this kind of, like, connection point, and there is no love there. But it did get better, and it was released. Window strikes are the #1 cause of wild bird deaths besides cats. Keep your cats inside, please. And so thinking about those types of parallels in my work too. And this is where I'm starting to, like, kind of have my crisis, because I'm like, okay, you saw the work with my dad on the horse. Like, that's really, like, pretty maximal. And if you've seen my work before any of this ghostwriter stuff, it's a hell of a lot more maximal than this. So, like, this is super minimal, and I started kind of having, like, this identity crisis where I'm like, oh my God, am I making, like, really sparse work? Like, what does that mean? My gallery says it's me maturing. I don't know if I believe that, but I kind of had like another little crisis where I was like, fuck, I want to have fun making art again. It's not that I don't, but it's like after that piece of my dad, I just like started questioning like, what am I going to do now? And I started thinking about my, clinic being a studio, the choreography of doing an intake exam on a bird. And I started shooting the birds in film. So the same camera that I shot with when I started photographing when I was 17, I put a little close-up kit, which is kind of like the cheap man's macro lens on the end of my camera. And I started shooting, sections of all of these birds that were coming into my care that were maimed by human infrastructure. And all of these birds were birds that I had to euthanize. And so these aren't the final images, right? But this is like a new kind of part of a process that I'm doing. So this is the indigo bunting hit by a window. Baby birds hatching that never made it out of the egg. And they're a little tender, they're a little tragic. I hate sentimental artwork, and I'm really fucking sentimental as a person. So that's kind of like the hard line. I'm having a hard time with that. And I actually haven't like shown any of this really. So this is like my kind of like tender, vulnerable moment, is showing this new stuff I'm making to try to be like, hey, it's okay to be like flailing a little bit. This is a Baltimore Oriole that hit a window, an American crow that actually didn't grow an eye on one side, and this eye was completely blind. So these are from neonicotinoid pesticides. Same thing here. Or the exams that I have to do. So this is me testing for a deep pain response, testing for a nerve response to see if this creature is paralyzed or has a back injury. A little owl caught in a thing of motor oil. And so most recently, I had a show at the ICP in New York City, and the curator had seen these photos, which, I say, like, do your college art, gallery show and no one will see it. Well, unfortunately, I did this, like, show in Italy that I thought no one would see, and then some curator saw it and was like, I want you to put these bird photos in your show. And I was like, no, they're not ready. Like, they're just photos. They're just things that exist. And he was really dead set on it. And he was like, I'm giving you this show. Either you take it or not. And I was like, well, God, like, okay, I'll take it, but can I put other work in there? So I had to negotiate it, but I got a chance to play. And so these are just like the last few slides. My mother, before she escaped the country, had a Canon AE1, a camera, and she used to photograph a lot. And there were only a few photos that she brought to this country that are part of the archive. But about 3 years ago, I found a bunch of rolls of film that I thought were from like the 90s, because she used to like, do like the family photo thing or like document things. And I developed them all because I was curious. One of them was the very first test roll of film that she shot on her Canon right before the revolution. And they're all blurry images of the sky. And I thought of that as, I don't like using metaphor often, but I was like, okay, what a metaphor. Like, this is like this place of hope, this place that these birds are supposed to be or exist in, and what does it mean to put them back into that sky? So in the background, these are screen prints of her photographs or crops of her photographs of the sky from that roll of film from 1977. And then my photographs printed as C prints on top, and then parts of her drawings. So there's kind of this codex that comes in. And so these are images from the ICP show that I just had in New York that I'm still processing. And then some installation shots as well. So there's the kind of large piece of my father. It's about 8 feet by 6 feet. And then the bird photos kind of come in and play. It's really important for me that the drawings, my mother's drawings, always accompany the photographs on the walls as well. And that's the last install shot. I think did I do half an hour? Did I do it? All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Shada, for sharing that deeply personal work. And thank you, Dominique, for that wonderful introduction. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second and final guest of the evening, Nicholas Boggs, whose new book, Baldwin, A Love Story, offers a vivid, intimate, and deeply human portrait of one of the greatest American thinkers and writers of the last century, James Baldwin. With this book, Nicholas doesn't just trace a life, as biographers often do, but he brings us into Baldwin's world in a way that feels alive, emotionally rich, and full of surprising moments of tenderness. It's a story about Baldwin, whose private life has been a point of curiosity for his admirers forever, but also about friendships, desires, and creative influences, and how creative influences shaped him. Above all, it's about love, as the title suggests, a force that traversed Baldwin's relationship with the people in his life and the characters he skillfully delivered to us on the page. Nicholas's connection to Baldwin's work runs deep and includes his work on the restored edition of Baldwin's children's book, Little Man, Little Man, a project that reintroduced a remarkable, long-overlooked piece of Baldwin's legacy to the world. Personally, before I was an admirer of Baldwin's work, I was an admirer of Baldwin, the person. I fell in love with his story in Paris, where for about a month, I worked as a guide for a company offering tours of the African-American experience in the city during the 50s and 60s. It was in the mound of notes I had to memorize for this work that I became enamored with Baldwin's story, which took on a new life after he fled the US for France in 1948. A decade later, in a pamphlet about the 2023 winners of the Whiting Nonfiction Awards, I was excited to learn about a writer named Nicholas Boggs, who was working on the book that every fan of Baldwin was going to seek out. And Nicholas delivers, with a rare combination of insight, compassion, and attention to the small details that reveal a story about Baldwin one can't put down. What I find especially moving about this book is the way Nicholas approaches Baldwin not only as an iconic figure, but as a person. A complicated, searching, brilliant, loving person. And in Nicholas's hand, Baldwin becomes not just someone we study, but someone we feel close to. Someone whose life invites us to reflect on our own relationships, our own creative struggles, our own ways of loving and being loved. It's a real gift to have Nicholas with us tonight, here in this room, to read from and talk about a book that is already generating so much excitement and conversation. Many, like myself, have been deeply touched by Baldwin's work or speeches over the years, and I have no doubt that hearing Nicholas speak about this new portrait of him will open up new ways of thinking about a writer whose influence continues to shape the world. Nicholas Boggs is the New York Times bestselling author of Baldwin, A Love Story, the first major biography of the iconic figure in over 3 decades. He also co-edited a new edition of Baldwin's collaboration with French artist Yoran Kazak, Little Man, Little Man, A Story of Childhood. He is a recipient of a 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and fellowships from the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Scholars in Residence Program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Gilder Lerman Center and Beinecke Library at Yale, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as residencies at Yaddo and McDowell. Most recently, he was a 2024-2025 John Hope Franklin Fellow at the National Humanities Center. Please join me in giving a warm Falk welcome to Nicholas Boggs.
Wow, these introductions are incredible. And Shada's work is amazing. That was really fantastic. Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Sharon, and thank you to the Fine Arts Work Center. In my book, I tell a story about Toni Morrison visiting James Baldwin in the south of France in 1973, where he proceeds to make some popcorn and take her down to what he calls his torture chamber, which is his study, where he reads the entirety of If Beale Street Could Talk all night long to her. So settle in, I'm about to read this entire book to you. No, I'm kidding. I will read 2 very short excerpts with some images alongside them. But I want to say it's particularly moving for me to be here tonight I spent a fair amount of time here in the summers in particular because my aunt and her partner, so my aunts have a little cabin in Truro. So it's really great to be here with them, Debbie Boggs and Margaret Barmack and their friends who are locals. And also Richard McCann was my mentor. And the only other time I've ever been here was around 2006 when he was giving a reading on the stage. He's since died. He was a member of the board of directors here for many years, and he taught it at American University. And I started working on this book, really writing it in his class. So I feel like he's with us here tonight. This book really began, however, I read Baldwin in the DC public schools when I was in the 8th grade, but that's a whole other story. But when I was in college, I took a class on Baldwin, and we read everything he'd written except for this children's book. And there were 2 paragraphs in a Baldwin biography that came out in 1994. This was 1996. And it barely said anything about it except there was this French artist that illustrated it. It sounded like they might be lovers, but it wasn't clear. So I wrote the second email of my life to David Leeming at Stonington, and I said, do you know anything about this obscure French painter, Joran Kazak? He wrote back a very nice email saying, I never met him, I don't know anybody still alive who met him, and I think he's dead too. So 7 years later, I've moved to New York to get my PhD, it's 2003, and I decided to send more emails to art historians in Paris to say, do you know anything about this deceased obscure French painter? Leaving my phone number, and a few weeks later, I'm in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, totally broke, and the phone rings, the landline, because there aren't cell phones yet. At least I didn't have one. And it's Joran Kazak calling from France. He's alive. He has many stories to tell me about Jimmy. Come on over to Paris. He has an exhibition. So I sign up for my 3rd credit card, and I go across. And that is what, I didn't know it then, but that's what started this journey. This was 2003. I ended up meeting with him. He was a fascinating guy. Interviewing him, discovering that there was this kind of great love story. He was married, Baldwin was the godfather to his son, he dedicated if Beale Street could talk to him. There was this incredible love story, hidden love story, and it took me many, many years to realize that this was the beginning of a book, and I moved backwards looking at these major love figures in his life, and I will read from sections from 2 of them tonight. These were platonic relationships, erotic relationships, collaborative relationships. I also explore his relationships with women like Toni Morrison and Lorraine Hansberry, but it's organized in these 4 sections. So the first section is Buford Delaney, a really important painter. I'll read from their meeting. We can show that image now. That's the wrong one. There you go. But the next one will make sure people will stick around for the next slide. This is Buford Delaney and Baldwin in Paris, but I'm going to read from the section. This is not the beginning of the book because there's a prologue, but this is the beginning of book 1. When they meet for the first time. It was with a growing sense of anticipation that the young James Baldwin finished sweeping the floors at his after-school job at a sweatshop on Canal Street and headed out toward the unfamiliar address, 181 Green Street. As he left the garment district and entered the lamplit streets of Greenwich Village, it was as if he were entering another country altogether. To passerby on the street, the 16-year-old must have looked like a stranger in the village indeed, a short, scrawny, dark-skinned figure, wide-eyed and weary and wrinkled work clothes a size too big. For a moment, he considered boarding the uptown train and returning to his family's Harlem apartment, but he dreaded going home, as we later describe how he felt that day, and there was something about Emil's insistence upon giving him this address that kept urging him forward. Buford Delaney was already a well-known figure in the village, and his reputation was about to explode with the publication of his friend and fellow artist Henry Miller's essay, The Amazing and Invariable Buford Delaney. Buford's studio was a, quote, heavenly abode full of canvases mad with color and so cold its stove couldn't possibly warm, quote, the chill of the grave, which emanates from its dripping walls, floors, and ceiling. The streets outside were, quote, infested with the sinister shadows of crime and with prowling alley cats, which thrive on the garbage that litter the gutter and pavements. But even these exaggerated descriptions would not deter locals and out-of-towner visitors alike from finding their way to Buford's studio. There they would wait outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unusual man who hobnobbed with artists and celebrities such as Canada Lee, Ethel Waters, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Marian Anderson, and who was characterized by those who met him as a shaman, a Buddha-like figure, even a minor deity. Baldwin arrived at the address to find a faded brick tenement that was no different from the others on the tree-lined block, rows of zigzagging fire escapes angling up into the night sky. After he pushed his way through the front door and climbed the decrepit stairs, he tried to control his nerves as he knocked on the door. A short, round, brown man came to the door and looked at me, he later wrote, with the most extraordinary eyes I've ever seen. He was only in his mid-30s, but to Baldwin, he looked ancient. And after he'd finished his, quote, instant x-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal column, which I had said usefully Emile sent me, that's a friend at school, he smiled and said, come in, and opened the door. It was a modest studio warmed only by a black pot-bellied stove, but for Baldwin, the drama of Buford's presence there had transformed even its firescape into the most exclusive terrace in Manhattan or Bombay. Like many before him, he was most entranced by the sight of the colorful canvases and then by the easels, some of which were turned against the walls while others were covered by white sheets. Then he fixed his eyes on the old phonograph, and it wouldn't be long before he was spending hours with Buford, listening to records, scratchy music with the voices of blues singers wafting through the air at all hours of the day and night. I had grown up with music, Baldwin would write, by which he meant church music. But now, on Buford's small black record player, I began to hear what I had never dared or been able to hear: Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Ella Fitzgerald, and Fats Waller. He would come by as often as he could after school or after he got off from work, and sometimes they would sing along, Buford's deep voice blending with Baldwin's high tenor. Other times they would simply listen. When they did talk, unlike Baldwin's father, Buford did not lecture him. Instead, he spoke to him in a soft voice and taught him how to really hear the jazz and blues, not as the degraded, godforsaken mediums his father had said they were, but as part of his heritage. These early sessions would begin to unlock something for him as a budding writer that even all his reading the libraries and his conversations with Bill Miller, a teacher, could not. When I realized that music, rather than American literature, was really my language, he later said, I was no longer afraid. And then I could write, really write. This was why, almost miraculously, it seemed, Baldwin had found in Buford, as he would put it, quote, walking, living proof for me that a black man could be an artist. Okay, so I'm gonna move forward, way forward from there to the second slide. This is Baldwin with Lucien Happersberger, actually back in New York in the early 60s, but again, I'm gonna describe when they first met in 1 second. Incredible photograph, very expensive to include in the book. People are like, Nick, your book's a bestseller, drinks on you. And I'm like, I haven't seen a cent from this book yet, and the permissions for this book were insanely. There's a really, since there's visual art interest, there is a color, really fully color insert to the book where the Buford Delaney estate actually was incredibly generous and allowed me to use many photographs, like rare photographs of art that have never been seen before, actually. So take a look. Okay. And this is about the same length, just so you know. And then I'm going to end, and we're just going to take questions. Okay. The bar in question was just a short walk from the restaurants and cafes nestled at the crossroads of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, their legendary names lit up in lights. Café de Flore, Le Demago, and Café Royal, not to mention Le Select and Brasserie Lip. But to enter La Reine Blanche on this winter night in 1949, just a few days after Christmas, was to step into what felt like an entirely different world. Gone were the clusters of British and American expatriates cadging cigarettes as they table hopped and indulged in the myth of post-war Paris, popularized by their predecessors, most notably Hemingway, Stein, and Pound. Instead, the ambiance conjured by the Art Deco chic of these establishments, replete with purple moleskin banquettes and Charles Gary painted ceilings, was replaced by a charmless door beyond which a long, poorly lit tunnel thick with cigarette smoke was filled to capacity with throngs of men laughing and talking as they stood at the bar or leaned against the walls, eyeing each other and sipping suggestively from their drinks. On most nights, there was not a single woman in sight except for the bar's patron, Madame Elise. Rarely moving from her perch on a high seat in front of the cash register, she was described by one habitué as an impassive mountain of stone surmounted by a tightly pulled and smoothly sculpted mound of cold stone gray hair. Her flesh was gray, the account goes on, and she dressed in gray. But for a twitch at the corners of her mouth, her welcoming smile disturbed no muscle in her face. A bouncer was never required. It was also said because when she deigned to move, however slowly that might be, she could still effortlessly manhandle the roughest of her clients, of which there were more than a few. The bar, after all, thickly populated by trade, was cruising territory, and the frequency of police raids meant customers knew if they had forgotten to carry their identification papers, they should consider going elsewhere that night. La Reine Blanche, of course, translates into the White Queen, and on most nights that would appear to be a perfect description of most of its clientele. But tonight the figure holding court was most likely the only non-white person in the place. From a distance, it must have looked like a group of men gathered around no person at all, so diminutive was the storyteller at the center of their attention. But if one waded through the crowd and made their way to join them, invariably they would have been struck by an unmistakable sight in their midst. A 25-year-old Black American with large, animated eyes, talking a mile a minute in his broken and barely intelligible, yet irrepressibly enthusiastic rendition of the French language. A drink in one hand and his signature cigarette in the other, which he was waving in concert with his words. He was by now no stranger to the denizens of La Reine Blanche, which had become his regular haunt. Have you met Jimmy Baldwin? Was a not infrequent question passed along to newcomers among the American set in particular. Indeed, for many of them, quote, meeting Jimmy was an integral part of their induction into life on the left bank. Flanking him that evening were two of the closest friends he'd made since his arrival in Paris just over a year ago. The first was a German Jewish man in his mid-40s called Sasha Niederstein, who had come from Berlin in the early 1930s and lived in the south of France under a false name to evade the Nazis. He now resided in a large studio on Avenue de Ségur with prominently displayed paintings by two people whose names I can't pronounce. He was renowned for the famously fastidious meals he concocted in his kitchen, hung with copper pots and pans, and over which he graciously dispensed avuncular wisdom to his evening visitors, most especially to one James Baldwin. The second friend was Tom Michaelis, a German-American attorney who was fast becoming something of a benefactor to Baldwin, whom he deemed a genius, and who was, in any case, a key figure in the outrageous story Baldwin was now telling of the stolen bedsheet, which was building furiously towards a dramatic denouement. Tom and Sasha had heard it before, so as the audience listened with rapt horror and glee, the two of them were focused instead on an unfamiliar face that had joined the group. It belonged to a slender, handsome, and shaggy-haired 17-year-old Swiss would-be painter who had recently fled his feuding parents in Switzerland and arrived in Paris virtually penniless, much like Baldwin, to try to discover himself as an artist. With a mix of envy and pride, Tom and Sasha noticed that two men's eyes had locked. They sensed immediately that they were witnessing something momentous, and they were right, for James Baldwin had just met the person he would come to call the love of my life. His name was Lucien Happersberger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing that reading. We're now going to segue into our Q&A for the evening, and we'll have a mic floating around and have anyone who has questions for our guest tonight. The lights will be on soon as well. I see your hand, yes.
Hi, both of you. Thank you very much. Shaida, I was... Hi, Shaida. I am so jealous of the connection you made with your mother to be able to discuss those intimate parts of her life. How did that come about? And how do you talk about solitary confinement with your mother?
I don't think I had a choice. I think it's because both my parents were so deeply traumatized about what happened to them that they didn't share it with one another. My father felt guilty that he was, involved in the political party that he was. He thought that was the reason my mom got captured. My mom, was worried that she got captured and led them to my father. And so they just kind of had this guilt, and they wouldn't talk to one another. And so I was their captive audience. But it's funny. I recently just did an interview with someone that asked me if I went to therapy because of everything. And I was like, well, everyone should go to therapy. Of course I do. But these aren't the questions that like occupy my time in therapy because it's so matter of fact, you know? I'm really, really glad that my mom shared all of this stuff with me, especially given where I grew up. You know, these aren't the types of issues that were being talked about in public schools in Ohio or even private ones, you know? She's just very open about sharing it all, and she always has been to this day. Thanks for the question.
Do you worry about your parents having their citizenship being taken away with our current administration?
It's crossed my mind, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
I will talk all night.
Go on.
We'll get you next.
Again, thank both of you so much for sharing your writing. First, in terms of your writing, Ida, this kind of dovetails with the other question about the citizenship. I mean, you're living now in a time when we're seeing tyranny take over and your parents escaped from that. Or did you talk to her about how you're experiencing what's happening and what kind of responses, can we learn from her experience?
It's interesting for me, like, we are living, in unprecedented times, for sure. Thinking about what they lived under is still so much more horrifying to me. I mean, like, this is crazy what we are dealing with, but I mean, my parents talked to me about like witnessing their friends getting executed in front of them, or, I mean, we have ICE raids. So it's, we're seeing these things happen in different formats and different times. And yeah, we're sharing notes, but I think there's this difference of like, what does it mean to resist and how does one resist? And my father is not quiet about resistance, and he's gone to jail many times for his, actions. My mother was she's always said that you can't fight fire with fire, you have to fight fire with water. And what does it mean to persist quietly, or to kind of like be in the kind of undergrowth of things and like working from below? And so I kind of take like a both and like kind of way, seeing like what's happening in our world now. It takes all sorts of different types of actions. And I think there's this expectation of immediacy that my mom has actually like pointed out, is that like we expect change to happen so quickly. And I think social media and like having, everything at our fingertips helps do that. But I think that's her constant reminder, is to just keep at it.
Hello? Oh, hi. I just had a quick question. You talk about your father being a Marxist, and I'm very curious of how a Marxist ends up in America. And I guess that, that journey.
Yeah, I'm laughing because if he was here, he would really be laughing too. Hiding, cosplaying. I think there's a lot of, he came here because he was only able to come here. So he escaped to Turkey, then from Turkey to Italy, lived in Italy for 6 months. And to become a political refugee, you need to have someone that vouches for you. And luckily, a bunch of, his medical friends and professors had escaped before the revolution. And they were Marxists, but they got out before, and they had started working at Yale somehow. And so my father wrote to his now friend Asghar, and Asghar wrote him the letter of support. And Asghar said, no matter what you do, just do not let them know anything about why you were in hiding or why they had a bounty on your head. And so there's all sorts of reasons, especially during that time in Iran. If you're Baha'i, you can get executed. You're Kurd, you could get executed. You don't believe in God, you could get executed, which, obviously my parents weren't religious either. And so he just failed to mention the reason that he was being persecuted. But yeah, no, he says that the big joke is that I'm not a good Marxist because I'm too bourgeois, and he reminds me of it constantly. I like nice things, but, you know.
I'd like to ask Nicholas a question. These are beautiful presentations, both of you, really, and I feel lucky to be here. I'm interested in thinking about Baldwin in our contemporary moment. He's been kind of enjoying something of a critical and popular renaissance that's been kind of cresting for 15 or 20 years, and I think of your book as maybe a high watermark in that moment. And I think about something like, I'm Not Your Negro as a film that kind of used Baldwin in a very specific way at a specific moment in time. So I'm curious to think about how your book participates in our moment, like how it speaks to our time, like what the Baldwin of 2025 is for you or for us collectively.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and nice to see you. I've been so embedded in this book, like just in the archives and in trying to tell the story, that I'm not, and I've never felt comfortable sort of speaking for Baldwin, in part because he's not with us, but also because he had such an idiosyncratic mind, and he was constantly changing his mind, and that's something that I sort of really realized while I was writing the book and going through the archives. So, for example, he changed his mind about Palestine, as you know. I mean, after he went there, and he changed his mind about gender. I mean, he was saying some pretty sort of like patriarchal things about gender earlier in his life, and then later in his life influenced by his friendship with Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, and others. And as you know, he got a lot more left later in his life. He was no longer this kind of darling of the white liberal establishment. So I think it's hard for us to know how I would never say how he's reacting, but I think what we can do is look at his later work in particular, where those changes were happening around gender. He was even working on his last play, what involved the AIDS epidemic. And I think the evidence of things not seen, I think, was really important. I mean, scholars have written about this, but I underscored it in my book, is this was about the Atlanta child murders. And this was written, he was writing this in the 80s, and he was already writing about how sort of the media and sort of cultural landscape around the representation of black people had gone from like nothing to kind of a saturation with these images of criminals. And I think he'd have a lot to say about cell phones and the ways that kind of the murders of black teenagers being witnessed by all of us, but also by their peers, like what that does to us as a society and a culture. I don't know exactly what he'd say, because I'm sure it'd be way more brilliant than anything that I could come up with, but I think it's important to remember, it's not so much a question for me, what would he write about it, but what was he already writing about that we need to turn to.
This is one for Nicholas. Who took the picture of James and Lucienne, and what were they doing there?
I forget the name of the photographer, but this was in the I think it was 1963, I believe. I think it's when he was directing, not directing, he wishes he was directing, when his play Blues for Mr. Charlie was on Broadway, which was a huge drama with Lee Strasberg. It was a huge drama because his lover, Lucienne, was having an affair with Diana Sands, the actress, and ended up marrying her. This kept happening to him. But he was also kind of like Baldwin's business manager. So you see that Baldwin's on the phone, right? And Lucienne is kind of there shirtless, like, eh. So I think it reflects kind of, one of the things that I explore in this book is how these relationships were really malleable that he had, and they shifted over time. So, for example, with Buford Delaney, this was his spiritual father, his sort of father figure, but then Baldwin was really taking care of him later in his life. Buford had wanted a romantic relationship with Baldwin, but instead accepted his paternal one. Lucienne and Baldwin were involved when Lucienne was 17 and Baldwin was 24. And then and then he married a woman and had a kid, and then they were involved again later on, and then he married Diana Sands, and then they segued into kind of a very messed up business relationship. But by the end, it was Lucienne who came to his bedside and was with him when he died. Same with Engin Cezar, who I haven't talked about, but this is the very famous Turkish actor that Baldwin followed to Istanbul, where he finished another country and wrote The Fire Next Time. And they had a very complicated relationship as well that went through these various different iterations. And then Joran Kazak, the final figure, who also was kind of a friend, a lover, a collaborator, an inspiration, a muse. So I feel like the photographs do tell a lot. And if you look at the insert, you'll see a photograph of Baldwin with Joran in Tuscany. And I won't go into it. It really explains a lot about their relationship.
Yes, thank you too for bringing Baldwin back to us tonight. I was a teen in the 60s, first reading Baldwin's essays, and one of the things you said is, "He'll talk not what he might say, but what he has said." And one of the essays that really touched me was Sonny's Blues, and knowing about his relationship with his brother, who was an addict, and his love for him, and the personal and authentic, genuine way he couldn't help him. I'm just wondering if anything came up in your speaking to him. That's one part. The other part is being not you're being not a person of color. Did that have any effect in your doing your work?
Oh, zero. No, I'm kidding. No, of course it did. Yeah, of course it did. So, but the first question, I'll answer the second one. So Sonny's Blues is this excellent short story, probably regarded as his finest short story. And it's actually, I think it's more about, as I discussed in the book, it's more about his relationship with Arnold, this young jazz musician who had addiction issues and ends up actually in Bellevue. So Arnold is one of those figures that has not been written about that much. So I really tried to explore the impact that he had on his creative process, but also he took him to Corsica, where no Baldwin scholar had gone there before, and I actually hunted down, well, my mother helped me a lot, that's a whole other story, but I found the house where Baldwin had gone in Corsica and spent 7 months and taken Arnold with him, and then contemplated taking his own life by going down to the water there. So in terms of your other question, no, I just talked about this with Michelle Norris on her Substack, which was really fun. No, I mean, I'm always happy to talk about the question of what it means to write from quote unquote outside your culture. I know that as a gay or queer person, when somebody who doesn't identify that way writes about a queer figure, my first instinct is like, I don't know, you know? And then it really just comes down to, you know, how much research did they do? How respectful are they of the subject? And are they willing to engage this question? And are they also willing to be told that you did a bad job, right? If you have to be judged, as Baldwin always said, by the art itself. So if you take on a project like this, you better do your research. Fortunately, I spent my entire life researching this book. So I feel comfortable with the final outcome.
There's a question right there. Oh. Go ahead. Mike's coming.
Your question about the photograph someone already asked. I mean, the question about the photograph. So this is a question for Shada. Let's see. What are your parents, besides your work, because it's so much, your work is so much a product of your parents and a reflection of them. So, I mean, what do they see as a future for Iran? You know, going from Mossadegh to Pahlavi to, you know, I mean, do they see an endless cycle like Russia, or
It's hard to imagine an Iran that's going to be free, honestly. I think my father, they're very different. They're both cynics, but my father somehow has a lot more optimism that, you know, if the protests continue, or if people continue, and there's some sort of like undercurrent or uprising, that eventually it will prevail. My mother doesn't believe any such thing. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit more with my mother. There isn't, kind of like our Democratic Party, unfortunately, there isn't enough of a like momentum and cohesive force. No one's like, there's so many different kind of factions, and everyone's arguing and disagreeing about the right way to mobilize. And I think that's to their detriment, because that's what makes, the Ayatollah's party continue to be able to rule with brute force. And things like sanctions, for example, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, aren't helping, the people. They're actually hurting the people, and they're actually helping the government so much more. So as long as, Western intervention's not going to understand, and until there is some way for the left to unify, which I don't know if there is. I don't have much hope, and I don't think they do either, but my dad still tries. I mean, it's all we can do, right?
Can I ask
Sorry,
you,
that's a sad question, sad response. I'm really downer today.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to ask you about your work, actually. So I'm thinking of the Iranian-American poet Solmaz Sharif, who I think was a fellow here, who wrote that great, that great poetry collection called Look, where she's drawing on language of the State Department and sort of making it strange or reframing it and all of that. So I was just wondering, like, this turn you've made recently, of these two
crisis?
Yes, of these two. Yeah, of these two. What is your process vis-a-vis? Yeah, your process. Tell us more about that.
Like how I make?
No, I mean, to the extent people have been asking you, like, about your family and about your past. So I'm wondering how that actually works in the formal making of it. You talked about it in there, but if you could say a little bit more.
I mean, I think so much of it for me, I'm looking at a lot of cinema, actually Iranian cinema. And if you're thinking about like Iranian cinema, Iranian literature, just Farsi, like a language even, it's deeply poetic and cynical and morose, and it's very much about time, passage of time, similar to and I think a lot about, like, obviously magical realism and Garcia Marquez, like being kind of that like pinnacle of how we understand magical realism, and how time isn't like linear, and time kind of is like suspended, and it jumps between past and present and future. And I think that's what I try to do in my studio, especially when I'm working with my parents. It's like there isn't a timeline as to like how things are made or when things are made, or when I'm constructing them. It could take weeks to kind of build these theatrical tableaus, and while I'm building them, I'm trying to watch or look at as many things as possible. I'm like obsessed with Jack Smith right now, and like watching flaming creatures like over and over and over again, and thinking about if there's a way to scramble that in the studio, and then when they get in there, they scramble it all. Because my mom will be like, no, this isn't right. And I'll be like, but I think it's right in my mind. But I have to, if it's a collaboration, you have to like kind of acquiesce. And so I let her kind of take over, and she starts moving things around. And then I'm like, oh my God, this is all wrong, but maybe it's right. And it's just it's kind of this play, this non-linear form of play that makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I think that's what makes it work. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, because I think she's playing too. I mean, there's linguistic play that's happening there, even with the very serious subject matter.
Totally. I just finished this video piece like a few weeks ago, and it's very much about play, and it's all of these videos that she's been taking. She just got her first smartphone, and she's an agoraphobe, so she leaves the house sometimes, but they live in the desert in Albuquerque now, and she's decided to start creating these characters for all of the like animals that live in the desert behind their house. And so she's going out and she's filming them on her phone, and she's narrating their stories and then sending me text messages with like all of these like weird stories. So the rattlesnake is her favorite. She has a lot of conversations with it, and there's a scrambling of time there that I'm interested in. Yeah, thanks.
I think we'll take one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, my question is also for Shada. I'm wondering what you make of the current state of Iranian diaspora art and literature.
Ooh.
Back up on the podium.
Okay, so like there is this expectation. I think that, this is actually, okay, here we go. I just had my opening at the CAC in Cincinnati about a month ago, and my parents came, and it was their first time coming to one of my exhibitions. And it was horrible, not because they were there, but because the audience had acted like they had never spoken to someone from Iran before, and they were accosted. My mother was asked about solitary confinement. My father, because of the picture of him with like the rug on his horse, people were coming up to him and asking him about Persian carpets. And it reminded me very much about me being in school and the understanding that other kids had. Like when I talked about my mom being in solitary confinement, people were like, so your mom's a criminal? Because, you know, like the carceral system's obviously like different here. Or when Aladdin came out and like my Marxist anti-American parents wouldn't let me watch Disney, everyone was like, oh, do you have a magic carpet or a flying rug? And I think that there is this, the Iranian diaspora, I think part of understanding one's own culture is, unfortunately, in the States through an Orientalist lens. And what does it mean to adopt symbols that, you know, are prescribed to the Swana region or prescribed to the other by the West? And I think something that I see that's really unfortunate in diasporic work is when it's like, you know, clinging to those kind of pillars as a foundation as to how something should move through the world. You know, diasporic stories are so in between. There's so much oral history, so much narrative tradition that is lost. And I think like I'm so much more interested when people can pull from that instead of kind of resting on the obvious to, you know, satiate the American palate. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on diasporic artwork.
I think we have time for one more, actually. There's a question right there.
I'm just wondering, would you consider yourself first an historian / researcher or writer?
Toni Morrison has that famous line about you have to write the book that you want to read, and this was the book that I wanted to read when I was in college, you know, when I made that email that I wrote. And so I didn't think of it consciously this way, but I think I spent my whole life becoming the writer who could write this book. And so I got my PhD, and then I knew I didn't want to write academic work, so I did not want to be a literary critic / historian. And then I got my MFA, where I studied with Richard McCann and worked on some fiction. And I'm going to go back to, I'm writing like creative work in the future, like nonfiction, memoir, and stuff like that. So I consider myself a writer, but it was this book that turned me into one.
How about a round of applause for our guest this evening? So just a few reminders before we segue into the next phase of the evening. Our next FAWC Friday event will take place on Friday, January 9th, and we are thrilled to welcome visual artist Jim Drain and writer and FAWC alum Michael Diegler. So we hope to see you there. A few other announcements. Lee's Buck King's Painting Time will be viewing in the gallery. Please be sure to also visit the holiday market. Nicholas will be signing books as well in the holiday market section, so if you want to buy a copy of Nicholas's book and get it signed, please make sure to check that out. And finally, Studios 5, 7, 6, 9, 10, and 13 are open. Please make sure to check those out and see what our visual arts fellows have been up to. And also please make sure to head on over to the print shop for some fun hand-making art activities. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Happy holidays, and thank you for coming.